Australia's transport system is a joke. I know you'll bash me in the comments, but wait, hear me out before commenting on this video. Truth is always bitter, and you have to listen to it. Do you ever feel like getting around in Australia is way harder than it should be? Whether it's sitting in endless traffic, waiting for a bus that never shows up, or squeezing into an overcrowded train, our transport system is an absolute mess. And the worst part? It's been like this for decades. Every few years, politicians promise to fix it, yet here we are, still dealing with the same rubbish. Let's talk about facts. Australia has one of the most expensive and unreliable public transport systems in the world. According to a 2024 report, Australia ranks as the third most expensive country globally for public transport, with the average commuter spending $39.35 per week just to get around. In cities like Brisbane, this cost goes up to $59.67 per week, eating up nearly 20% of household income. But cost isn't the only problem. Accessibility is a disaster too. In Australia's 5 largest cities, only 50% of people have access to frequent all-day public transport, meaning the other half are forced to rely on cars. And for those using the train, get ready to squeeze in. Sydney's trains are operating at over 135% capacity during peak hours, with overcrowding becoming a daily nightmare. And don't even get me started on high-speed rail, something we should have had years ago, but instead it's just another empty promise. Discussions about high-speed rail between Sydney, Canberra and Melbourne have been going on since the 1980s, yet here we are in 2025. And the closest we've gotten is some exploratory drilling for a Sydney to Newcastle route, labelled an uncosted fantasy project by critics. So today, we're breaking it all down. Why is our transport system so bad? Why does nothing ever change? And most importantly, can we actually fix it? Let's get into it. Australia's public transport system isn't just bad, it's a national embarrassment. While countries around the world are racing ahead with world-class transit systems, we're still stuck with infrastructure that barely keeps up with demand. Trains that break down mid-commute, buses that never show up, trams that don't go anywhere useful. This is the daily struggle for millions of Aussies. And let's be real, we've been putting up with this for way too long. The biggest reason? We simply don't invest enough. Our government loves spending billions on highways and toll roads while public transport gets the scraps. Just look at the numbers. Over the past decade, more than $200 billion has been spent on roads, while public transport funding has lagged behind. In 2021-2022 alone, the government spent $36 billion on road-related projects, up from $33 billion the previous year. Meanwhile, major public transport projects face delays, cost blowouts, or just don't happen at all. Take Melbourne's Airport Rail Link, a project that has been talked about since the 1970s. Despite promises, early construction in 2022, and multiple announcements, it has now been pushed back again, with completion delayed to at least 2033. Or look at Sydney's metro expansions, one of the biggest public transport investments in Australia. The new metro line to the airport was supposed to open much sooner, but due to industrial disputes and supply chain issues, passenger services won't start until April 2027. And what do we get as a result? Overcrowded trains, unreliable buses, and gridlocked roads. Sydney trains run at over 135% capacity during peak hours, forcing commuters to squeeze in like sardines. Buses are so slow and inconsistent that many Australians would rather drive, even if it means sitting in traffic for hours. And our road-first planning model ensures that half of people in major cities don't have easy access to frequent public transport. We've been shortchanged for years. If we don't start demanding better, this cycle of underfunding and broken promises will never end. And it's not just about money, it's also about how our cities are designed to keep us trapped in cars. Australia's cities weren't built for people, they were built for cars. Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, almost every major city in the country forces people into their cars because public transport is either too slow, too unreliable, or simply doesn't reach where people live. The result? Gridlocked roads, frustrated commuters, and a transport system that feels like it was designed by someone who has never had to take a peak-hour train or bus in their life. One of the biggest problems is urban sprawl. Unlike compact, well-planned cities in Europe or Asia, Australian cities stretch out endlessly. Suburbs keep expanding further and further from city centres, but the transport infrastructure never keeps up. From 1990 to 2022, Sydney's population grew from approximately 1.3 million to 5.1 million, leading to significant urban sprawl. If you live in a place like Western Sydney or outer Melbourne, your daily commute is basically a nightmare. Either you're crawling through bumper-to-bumper traffic, or you're relying on a bus service that takes an hour just to get to the nearest train station. And let's talk about walkability, or lack of it. In most Australian suburbs, walking isn't an option. Footpaths are either non-existent or lead to nowhere. Cycling? Good luck with that. Bike lanes are an afterthought at best and a death trap at worst, with cyclists forced to share roads with impatient drivers. Compare that to cities like Amsterdam or Copenhagen, where cycling and walking are part of everyday life. In Copenhagen, at least 62% of residents commute to work or school by bike, collectively cycling over 1.4 million kilometers daily. Why are we so far behind? Being forced to drive everywhere isn't just inconvenient, it's expensive. Fuel prices keep going up, toll roads are everywhere, and parking is an absolute nightmare. And yet, despite all this, we keep designing our cities in a way that makes car dependency worse. We've trapped ourselves in a broken system. But what about public transport? Surely it should be a viable alternative, right? Well, not really. Let's get into why it's failing us next. Public transport in Australia is supposed to be an alternative to driving, but let's be honest, it's barely an option. Trains are constantly delayed or cancelled, buses are slow and unreliable, and if you live in the outer suburbs, good luck finding a service that actually gets you where you need to go. And the worst part? We're paying premium prices for a system that isn't even reliable. Let's start with trains. If you live in Sydney or Melbourne, you already know the struggle. Peak hour trains packed like sardine cans, sudden cancellations that leave commuters stranded, signal failures that seem to happen every other day. Sydney trains recorded 5,300 service cancellations in just 1 year, 2022 to 2023, while Melbourne's metro trains had over 12,000 disruptions in the same period. Compare that to cities like Tokyo or Hong Kong, where trains run like clockwork and delays are rare. Meanwhile, in Australia, being on time basically means not more than 10 minutes late. Then there's buses, assuming they even bother showing up. In most parts of the country, buses are slow, infrequent, and completely unreliable. In Brisbane, for example, nearly 1 in 5 buses failed to run on time in 2023. They get stuck in the same traffic as cars, making them useless for people who actually need to get to work on time. And if you live in the outer suburbs, you're lucky if you even have a bus service at all. Half of Australians in the 5 largest cities live too far from frequent public transport to rely on it. And let's talk about the cost. Australian public transport isn't just unreliable, it's overpriced. Sydney commuters pay some of the highest fares in the world, with a single train trip costing between $3.54 and $8.69. Compare that to Tokyo, where a similar journey costs less than $2, yet the service is far superior. When public transport is this expensive and this unreliable, why would anyone choose it over driving? This is why so many Aussies stick to their cars, even with the high fuel prices and ridiculous tolls. Australia has some of the highest road toll costs in the world, with Sydney drivers spending over $60 per week just on tolls. Because at least with a car, you have control. But what if there was a real alternative? What if we actually had high-speed rail? If there's one thing Australian politicians are great at, it's making big promises and delivering absolutely nothing. Every election, they roll out flashy transport plans, complete with artist impressions and vague timelines. Then, after they get voted in, the projects get delayed, scaled back, or scrapped entirely. Rinse and repeat. One of the biggest problems is short-term thinking. Governments only plan as far as the next election. Long-term projects like high-speed rail or major public transport expansions require decades of commitment. But when a new government comes in, they cancel or change everything the last one planned. This is exactly why so many of our major transport projects never get off the ground. And let's not ignore the influence of road lobbyists. Toll road operators and car companies have a vested interest in keeping Australia car dependent. More roads mean more profit. So instead of funding high-speed rail or improving public transport, governments keep throwing money at new motorways and toll roads, ensuring we stay stuck in traffic for generations to come. So where does that leave us? Are we doomed to live with this broken transport system forever?